Right now in our application, there's actually a bit of an issue. If we ever refresh our application, whether because we updated our code, or let's say, for example, in a live setting, if our user refreshes the page, they'll actually lose everything they have in their store, including their cart items. So if we were to refresh, our reducer gets reset completely, which makes a lot of sense because our application is reinstantiating and all of our initial states for all our reducers are being loaded. So it's like the app is in a brand new state. The only reason the user is being set is because our user's authentication status is not being stored by the application. It's being handled by Firebase Auth, if you remember when we did that lesson. So Firebase Auth gives us session persistence because it's aware of until when the user signs out, it's not going to actually end the session. Whereas for everything else in our store, we don't have any kind of storage of anything related in order to persist the state of the cart items that we're adding across our application, even on refresh or closing the window. Now, we want to fix this because in most e-commerce websites, it persists the user's cart in some way, shape, or form. If not when the user closes and reopens the website, at least if the user refreshes in the same session, in the same tab. Now, there's multiple ways that we can tackle this problem. One way is using Firebase, where we would store our cart items, and then they would belong to our user, so that whenever the user signs in, or whenever we're aware that a user auth state has changed, based on our app.js's user ref on snapshot getting fired, we could also pull in our cart, which we would store in our database. But we're going to do that actually later on in the course in a more advanced Firebase lesson. But right now, what if we just wanted to leverage what we had on the front end? What if we wanted to just store our cart items? Well, if you're familiar with local storage, it's actually possible. And the reason why it's possible is because our reducer state is pretty much just JSON objects. They're just large JSON objects, which is easy to store and easy to update, especially because our reducers are just functions that return object states, right? So it's really easy, you can imagine, if in some way we could store the state of what the reducer is in, and then when the app reloads, we just pull in whatever we stored and then populate the reducer as such. Now, there's a really easy library called Redux Persist that allows us to do exactly that, and it wires in with Redux so that we don't actually have to worry that much about it. But before we explore that, I want to talk about local storage because that's what the underlying tool it is being used by Redux Persist. So let's actually explore local storage a little bit. And it's pretty easy to actually start using. So we actually have access to it on our window object. So on our window object, we have access to both local storage and session storage, which are both the almost exact same means of storing something on our browser. The only difference is that session storage persists it throughout the session. So as long as our tab is open, even if we refresh the page, we'll still have access to what we've stored in session storage. Whereas if we close the page, then we would lose whatever it is that we stored in session storage. Whereas local storage will persist until we clear it out, meaning that if we close our window, close our browser, we'll always have access to it. But let's actually explore how to use it. Now, local storage has a get item and a set item. So one sets the item inside the storage, so it stores it, and then the get lets us pull it out of local storage. And we store them under string keys, right? So we give it a key, and that's what it'll store it under, and it'll also be the same key that we use to access it. But we have to store strings only. So let's say, for example, that we had a object we wanted to store, my object to store. And it's just equal to some object with my name of Yihua on it. Now, in order for me to store it, I would say window.localstorage.setItem, right? And then I would give it the key. So let's say my item. Now, what I want to do in order to actually store it is I have to convert this JSON object to a string. And we can do that with the JSON object that we get from our JavaScript. So we always have access to this. And this allows us to perform certain methods on our JSON objects, such as this one called stringify, which allows us to stringify our object. And all it does is it wraps this object inside of a string. And it converts all the keys also to strings, right? Which is required for JSON. So we'll say JSON stringify my object to store. And now window.localstorage just stored it. If we want to access it again, we'll just call window.localstorage.getItem and we'll say my item. And there we see that's our object, but stored as the string, right? Because we stringified it, and that's what it looks like. If we wanted to convert it back, we can just set a new object to my retrieved object. And let's say we just call it our window.localstorage.getItem, right? So we want to get it under our key that we set it under. And then now let's say we wanted to turn it into a string. Well, we would say JSON.parse, right? Which is a method on that same JSON object we were talking about. And let's say we do my retrieved object. Well, now we get our object back. So really handy, right? Local storage is great for this. If I refresh, I'll see that I still have access to local storage. And now if I look, there's the string. We can just parse it again. And now I've managed to persist this object across my application state. It's persisted. So because all we're storing are JSON objects, wouldn't it be great if we could just store the state of our cart and then persist it, and then whenever our application refreshes or opens up for the first time, we pull it out of local storage and then update our reducer to show what we had stored. Well, that's what the library Redux persist does. But I wanted to show you what local storage was and session storage. Session storage is almost the identical to local storage. But again, it just doesn't store across closing the tab. But I just wanted to show you what's happening under the hood with this library we're to bring in of Redux persist.